They contracted with them to build a raft to carry the wagons across the river. So they built it in Escalante.
Smart.
Disassembled it, took it down to Hole in the Rock, lowered it down from cliff to cliff or whatever, got it down to the water's edge, rebuilt it. So when they finished this road, the raft was ready to go. And they would take 2 wagons out there and just float it across the river to the other side. Now, interestingly, when they first started it, one of the first wagons had oxen. And they got the wagons out and unhooked the oxen, and they had a boy there that was in charge of the oxen. Well, they got about halfway across the river and those oxen decided, no, this isn't for us. And so they went overboard. So they took this little 11-year-old boy with them. Okay, now, what are oxen gonna do in the water?
Swim.
They're gonna paw like crazy to swim. This little boy was pretty sharp. Instead of trying to come back up with those oxen, he went underneath the raft and came up downstream. He was fine.
Smart.
Pulled him back up on the raft and they all went across. Well, they learned quickly, instead of carrying the oxen or the horses, mules, whatever, on the raft, they would swim them across. So they swam all of their livestock across and carried the wagons. Okay, so we've halfway conquered the monster. You're down in this canyon. What do? Where do you go? You have to go up the other side, right? Makes sense to me. Now, the other side wasn't quite as bad as this, but this is what it looked like.
Oh my gosh.
This is called Cottonwood Hill.
Oh my gosh.
You know, and it's not quite as steep as this. Part of the problem was they had to build a road up through here, but this is a sand dune. Have you ever driven a wagon like that across a sand dune?
No, but I
Those
tried to
little
walk.
2-inch yeah, exactly. Those little 2-3-inch wheels, you know, they would bury almost up to the axle. So just getting up to the road was a challenge. Well, they finally got everybody up on top.
Oh my god.
All right, so they're about 2 weeks down to here, 6 weeks to build the road, and another 2 weeks to build this road. Okay, so that's 10 weeks. Remember, how long did they think they were going to be out there? 6 to 8 weeks. Okay, so they're already ready. Now, we get up on top of this thing, and they look back and say, we've conquered the monster. Life is good. Then they turned around and looked the other direction. Well, maybe life isn't quite that good. Because these challenges lay ahead of this thing. The Grand Gulch is like a miniature Grand Canyon. And it runs, starts right here at the river, and it works its way all the way up here to the Blue Mountains. Okay? And, you know, how do you get across this? I mean, look, folks, with a wagon like that, even if it's only 50 feet wide and 20 feet deep. So they ended up going all the way up around the north end of it. Thank you. They got up here into the cedar groves. Now, if you know the cedar trees, they're not a real tall tree. 6, 7 feet, maybe 8 feet tall, but they're really bushy. Lots of limbs, and they grow close together. How do you get a wagon through there?
Gotta cut it all up.
Gotta cut it all down. So they went to work and cut a road through the cedar groves.
Wow.
Up there. They got down to this thing, Comb Ridge. Now, how many of you came in from the west? Nobody came from the west?
Not today.
Anybody going to the
Yes.
west?
Yeah.
All right, about 10 miles west of here, you'll come through a cut that goes through this, and it goes through and then turns and runs down the face of it.
Okay.
When they got to this is an upheaval. You know what upheavals are?
Yeah,
where the tectonic plates have slid over each other. One of them has come up. This is an upheaval, and it runs all the way from Arizona all the way up into Utah. 800 to 1,000 foot cliff on this. Well, somebody said, I know that this crosses the San San Juan River which runs along here. I bet if we went down there, we could get around the edge of this on the riverbank. Okay, let's go. So the main party headed down towards San Juan, and they sent some scouts down ahead of us. Well, when they got down there, Comb Ridge was here, the river was right there. There's no riverbank. So they came back up and found a spot where they could build one more road. And this is called San Juan Hill. Now, I've been out I've hiked this one. We took some boats down and hiked up from the bottom up it. And that's a steep hike.
Pretty hard climb.
Pretty hard climb. This thing here, the switchbacks and the chute, how they managed to do it. I was on a side-by-side. Okay, rubber tires, suspension, padded seats, power steering. They were in this thing. Well, anyway, they built this road up here, and I've hiked this several times. And it's a pretty decent hike, but not nearly as bad as this.
Wow.
But it took 7 teams to pull one wagon up this road.
Wow.
And the reason, not because it's so steep, but by this point they had been on the trail about 6 months. Very little water, very little feed. Their animals were exhausted.
Yeah.
They were just flat worn out. 7 teams to get one wagon up there. And they'd unharness the teams and take them back down, while another 7 teams pulled up and just round robin until they got them all up over the ridge. Now, remember, they were supposed to go to Montezuma Creek. Montezuma Creek's about 14 miles on up the river. When they got to Bluff, to this area here, you know, they rolled in here and it was fairly open out here. There was some cottonwood trees around, but, you know, they looked at it and thought, well, at least there's soil here. Maybe we can grow some crops. And so they circled their wagons and said, we're here. This is home. And that's where the fort part comes from. People ask, you know, was there a military contingent? There was not. But the fort comes from the fact that they circled their wagons. You've seen that in the Old West movies. Well, they did that for protection from the Native Americans. And they set up housekeeping. Now, when they originally were called, they were asked to come over here to develop peaceful relations with the Native Americans. That was their #1 goal. And to bring a little law and order to this area. You've heard of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid?
We just left Telluride.
Okay, yeah. Well, this area was perfect for them because of all these slot canyons and so forth. They could do their deed, and then they could come down here and hide out for months. So they were asked to develop those relationships and bring some law and order to these people.
Cool.
So when they got to Bluff, you know, they circled their wagons and began that process. Now, in a nutshell, albeit a coconut shell, sorry, that's the history of what brought these people to Bluff over here. Now, they did eventually establish those peaceful relations. It was interesting. One of the things that they discovered right off the bat was feed them and they'll be happy. They were hungry.
Surely wasn't no food here.
You know, I mean, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
They had some sheep and maybe some corn that they could raise and maybe an antelope or possibly a deer, but they were just hungry. And they were upset with the white man for sticking them down there without any real opportunity. So when they would come into town, there was one incident where there was about 100 warriors rode into town all decked out in their war paint and their rifles in hand and bows and arrows and so forth. And Jens Nielsen, this is his house, Catacorner, right over here. At the time, he was one of their leaders. And most of the men by then had spread out to find work. They'd gone to Colorado to work in the mines or work on whatever they could find. And so Jens was one of the few men that was left in town with all of the women and children. And these warriors rode into town, and Jens went out to talk to them. And he said, well, let's sit down and talk. Oh, we no talk. Oh, come on. He said, the women are going to fix a meal. Come and sit down and eat. So, okay. So they did. And by the time they got supper over, it was dark. Well, the Indians didn't fight it that night. So Jen said, okay, go back to your camp, get a good night's sleep, come back in the morning, we'll talk. So they did. They went back to camp, came back the next morning. And he said, okay, but first, let's have breakfast. And so they all sat down and had breakfast. And when it was all said and done, Jen said, okay, now let's talk. Oh, we no talk. You friends, you feed us good. And they got on their horses and left. So, they learned rather quickly that, the Native Americans were just hungry. Now, and I don't mean that they didn't have their faults, because they did.
Right.
We all do.
Right.
But that was a big thing. Feed them, show them that you're your friends, you're concerned about them. And they developed those peaceful relations.
Wow.
Yeah, but how long can you feed them? I mean,
Well,
how much food you got?
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But what they did was help them learn how to farm. These were farmers.
Right.
When they came across the plains and settled Salt Lake, one of the reasons that they started to spread out, people say, oh, it was a land grab by the Mormon church. Well, no, it was trying to survive, because there wasn't any Costco's or Targets or any of that.
Yeah.
And people were coming from the east, and they needed farmlands to grow the crops just to survive.
Right. Right.
And so that's why they were spreading out, was to find and develop that farmland.
It's like your ancestors down in Florida. They homesteaded, and so the Seminoles would come and they showed them how to grow crops down there, and then the Seminoles showed them the best fishing spots.
Yes.
So it worked
Right.
out. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I know one thing, when I got back there,